All right. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our webinar tonight on driving anxiety. My name is Hans Schroder. I'm a clinical psychologist at the University of Michigan in the Department of Psychiatry. And I work in the adult anxiety clinic here in psychiatry. And I'm so excited that we have an hour to talk about driving anxiety. And I've been working in the anxiety clinic for about 4 years now. And I have to say, one thing that we've seen a pretty continuous stream of is folks who have anxiety around driving. And that might be driving on highways, driving at night, driving in the winter, bridges, in congested traffic areas in Ann Arbor. There's so many reasons to be anxious about driving. And we're going to talk about those reasons tonight. And we're going to talk about how to overcome some of that anxiety around driving. And I'm really excited we have a whole hour dedicated to this. Before I say anything else, I want to give a shout out to Stephanie Daniel and Kat Bergman, who have really organized this webinar for us. They've done a lot of behind the scenes work to organize and advertise this. So thanks to both of you. And I'm really excited that I'm joined here tonight by two people who I admire a great deal. Dr. Tyler Grove is a colleague and a friend of mine here in the Department of Psychiatry in the Anxiety Clinic. And he's going to get us started by talking about anxiety more generally. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What do we want to do when we're anxious? What keeps some problematic anxiety around? So he's going to kind of set the stage for us. Then I'm going to hop back in and talk about driving anxiety in particular. What sorts of things keeps driving anxiety around? And then I'm very excited to then turn it over to Pat Blair, who's a former patient of mine. We worked together 3 years ago already. I can't believe it's been that long. He's a graduate of our exposure therapy program in the anxiety clinic, and he's going to tell us his story about how he overcame his driving anxiety using exposure therapy. And then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end. So make sure to submit your questions ahead of time if you have any throughout the webinar, and Stephanie can feed us some questions so that we can answer them. Before we jump in, I just have a little caveat I want to say. The content tonight is geared towards exposure therapy for driving. And we have everything is predicated on the idea. If you're going to try this out, we assume that you have a valid driver's license in the state of Michigan or wherever you're doing this. You have a driver's license. You know the rules of the road. You know how to drive safely. This isn't really about overcoming anxiety and fear that's getting in the way of you getting in the car and driving, whether it's on the highway, whether it's around the block. So we just say that you're cognitively able to and physically able to drive. So that's going to help with it's kind of the background necessary to do some of these exposures. All right, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Grove, who's going to tell us about anxiety more generally.
Yeah, thanks, Hans, for organizing all of this. I'm excited to be talking with all of you about anxiety in general. And oh yeah, I guess we should have gone over this. Hans already went over this, Dr. Schroeder went over this, but here's the outline for today. And yeah, I want to start off talking about anxiety in general. What is it? How would we describe it? Well, anxiety is a feeling, it's an emotion. And there's lots of different things that happen when we feel anxious. There are things that happen in our body. There are things that happen in our mind. And there are things that we may want to do or not want to do when we feel anxious. And we can actually put these experiences into three different categories. So physical, cognitive or thinking, and behavioral. Physical experiences of anxiety could be things that maybe we would expect, like our heart rate going up, or sweating, or shaking. It could also involve things that maybe we wouldn't necessarily tie to anxiety, like kind of tingling or numbness in our extremities, or changes in our vision or other senses. In terms of cognitive or thinking experiences, we can worry and we can kind of go down that line of what ifs. What if this happens? And what if this happens? And then this, and then this. And then we can have negative predictions about what's going to happen and negative predictions about how well we're going to be able to manage that difficult situation if it does happen. And then behaviorally, a big factor that we see is avoidance. So avoidance of anything that provokes anxiety. That could be a person, a place, situation, object, a memory, a physical sensation. You name it, we can try to avoid it. And we're going to talk in a little bit here about how avoidance is ultimately unhelpful, but it's definitely something we feel pulled towards when we're anxious. Another thing that can happen is maybe we don't avoid that anxiety-provoking thing, but we engage in safety behaviors when we do face it. So we're talking about driving today. An example of a safety behavior could be maybe you still drive, but you don't drive alone. You always have to have someone with you because driving alone feels really anxiety provoking. But if you drive with someone else, it doesn't feel as anxiety provoking. Maybe it feels safer. Maybe you feel more protected. So that would be an example of a safety behavior. And yeah, a fair question to ask is, why do we have these experiences? What's going on? Why do we have all these physical, cognitive, and behavioral experiences when we're anxious? Well, it goes back to this fight, flight, or freeze response. And this is the body's natural way to try to protect us when we're in danger. So when our brain perceives danger, it sets in motion this response that gets us ready to fight as hard as we can, run as hard as we can, or freeze. And that results in all these physical, cognitive, and behavioral experiences that we just talked about. And we want this system. This system is helpful. It protects us. It keeps us safe. For example, if a big venomous spider is coming towards us, this system activates and we find ourselves running away without even thinking about it. We didn't first think, oh, this is a dangerous spider, I should run away. We found ourselves running away. And that's what's supposed to happen. Fight or flight activates without us even realizing it's happening, at least initially. And it's designed to do that. Because in a life or death situation, those seconds can be critical. But there are times when the system activates too often or with too much intensity, even for things that aren't really dangerous. So for example, when studying for a test or taking a test, our anxiety about the test may become so intense, we're not able to really study or take the test. Maybe we worry while studying and we're not able to study as well. And then when taking the test, the anxiety becomes so intense we experience a panic attack. But it should also be noted that if someone had very little anxiety or no anxiety about taking this test, maybe they wouldn't study and then they wouldn't get the grade that they wanted. So some anxiety is actually helpful in this situation. It may push us to study and get the grade that we want. So there is a balance here, and some level of anxiety can actually be helpful. So just kind of an overview of what we talked about, anxiety has very important functions to alert us to potential danger, to keep us safe, protect us. It can improve our performance, help us meet goals, but it can also go too far. Tell us we're in danger when we're not, and get in the way of our goals. And so talking about driving anxiety, just like the spider that we already talked about, this is an instance where there is actual danger. So it's not surprising that driving or even the thought of driving could lead to anxiety and some level of that fight or flight response. And so that's what I said I was going to kind of circle back to avoidance. And that's we feel a pull to avoid when we feel anxious. But we know that over time, avoidance can really kind of make things worse. Because with each instance of avoidance, in this case, each time we avoid driving or we drive with these safety behaviors, we actually become more sensitive to driving. That anxiety grows, it builds. And maybe we've avoided driving for years, but then we're forced into driving. I mean, there's no way around it. We can't avoid it. We're probably going to experience some really intense anxiety, maybe to the point of a panic attack in terms of that fight or flight response. And well, so that's why we could not drive, we could avoid, we could not take the risk. But there's also a convenience that's offered by driving. We can drive to see friends, family, go to events. We can engage in hobbies. We can run errands. We can complete tasks that bring a sense of fulfillment and meaning. Ultimately, driving may have a huge impact on our quality of life. And so taking that risk is worth it because the alternative could mean a lower quality of life. Yeah, so with that, I will turn it back over to Dr. Schroder.
Thank you, Dr. Grove, for that overview on anxiety. So, yeah, I really want to emphasize what Dr. Grove was just mentioning, that quality of life can certainly be impacted. Can I go backwards here? Not sure. By not being able to drive. I mean, we're especially in the state of Michigan, to get anywhere, we pretty much have to drive. So we can see how avoidance, while understandable, can really start limiting what we're able to do. So I want to turn now to, okay, we've got this anxiety. What do we do with this? How can we start addressing anxiety? And in our clinic, we use a cognitive behavioral therapy framework. And what this means is that we're distinguishing between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. A thought is usually an interpretation or a statement. All drivers are dangerous. A feeling is what Tyler was talking about with anxiety or fear. And a behavior is what we're doing, what actions we're taking. So avoiding driving, only driving with a safe person, for instance. And it turns out that all of these factors influence one another. So how we think about a situation will influence how we feel and what we do. And what we do in a situation will influence our feelings and our thoughts. It turns out that it's really hard to change your feelings directly. I can't see anybody's faces here, but I'm just going to ask a question. Has anyone tried to wake up in the morning and say, all right, today, no anxiety, go, right? I can't see anybody, but I'm guessing some of you would say, yes, I've tried that and it doesn't work, which is unfortunate. Although none of us would have, Tyler and I would not have jobs if that were the case, if you could just snap your anxiety off. What we can do, however, is influence how we think about situations and our behaviors in those situations, and that should help us manage our feelings. So I want to turn now to getting into driving anxiety in particular. And I'm seeing if, okay, here we go. So what are the factors that keep driving anxiety around? So I want to talk about the thoughts and the behaviors. These are the things that we target in CBT. The first is thinking traps. And by the way, with thinking traps, all of us have these all the time. Everyone has thoughts like driving on the highway is dangerous. All other drivers are unsafe. I can't drive safely when I'm driving quickly. And I'm definitely going to get into an accident. All of us have had thoughts, these types of thoughts from time to time. It only really gets in the way when we're listening exclusively to these types of thinking trap type thoughts. They're very extreme. They're all or nothing, black and white. We might be jumping to conclusions. They're kind of these extreme thoughts. And, with regard to this, it's interesting, I've lived in a couple different cities, and in every city, I'll always hear, oh my gosh, Grand Rapids drivers are the worst, or Bostonians don't know how to drive, or, oh my gosh, those people in Ann Arbor, they should really learn how to drive. It's just interesting how we talk about driving, and even when we are driving, we always point out the terrible driver. Oh my gosh, what an idiot. He didn't use his blinker. Or you need to merge. We never pay attention to the safe drivers, right? So we never notice or comment on, wow, you know what? That person did a really nice job switching lanes. And again, that comes back to what Tyler was talking about with that fight-flight response. Our brain is programmed to detect threats and detect sudden movements so that we can stay safe. But if we're only paying attention to driving that is potentially unsafe or problematic, then we're going to kind of have a skewed perception that all driving and all drivers are dangerous. So the thinking traps is one part that keeps driving anxiety around. The second piece, which we're really going to focus on today, is avoidance and safety behaviors. So like Tyler was saying, avoidance comes in many forms. It ranges from not even getting in a car to having someone else drive for you, to only driving on particular roads and avoiding highways, only driving with a safe person. Backseat driving is a common example that can come up from driving anxiety. So you're not driving, but you're basically commenting and directing other people on how to drive. And again, commenting on other people's driving is a really common one. So Tyler foreshadowed this for us. With driving, there is some risk involved. And I was able to find some statistics from the Michigan State Police, this traffic crash data year-end report. The latest data comes from 2022. And it's interesting. When we're in the throes of really bad driving anxiety, we might predict that it's like, I'm definitely going to get in a crash and I'm definitely going to die. And those are really scary thoughts to have and might motivate us to avoid getting in the car. But when we actually look at the data, it suggests that in 2022, there were 300,000 crashes, and only 17% of them involved an injury to the person, but only 0.36% of all the crashes ended up with somebody dying. Now, that's a very, very small percentage, and that's just from the crashes. This does not account for all of the people that drive every day. So if you factor that in, the percentage might be much, and it actually is much, 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 much smaller. The trick with anxiety is I can present you mountains of data and statistics that tell you driving in Michigan is safe. But the anxious part of the brain is going to say, well, it doesn't matter because I'm going to be the one that gets in the fatal car crash. It's going to happen to me. And that's what anxiety does. It has these extreme thoughts. It kind of discounts data. So what I want to turn now to is how we can kind of bypass that thinking and get right to exposure therapy, which allows us to experience new information so that we can learn safe driving conditions, and we might be able to learn I can drive safely, even on the highway, and we can distinguish that from dangerous driving conditions. So I want to now turn to exposure therapy, and some of you here might have heard of exposure therapy before, but it's really the gold standard treatment for almost all anxiety problems that we use in the clinic. With exposure therapy, we're intentionally and gradually confronting the feared situation, the object, the person, the memory, whatever it is you're most afraid of. We're getting you exposure to that situation. We're trying to go exactly the opposite of what your anxious brain would do, which would say, you need to avoid that at all costs. Instead, we're confronting that situation. Okay. We use what's called an exposure hierarchy that I'll talk about in a few minutes to gradually move up a series of situations that bring up more and more anxiety. So I like to say we're never pushing anyone in the deep end of the pool with exposure therapy. We're working our way gradually. We're walking down to the shallow end of the pool and wading slowly over. We'll get to the deep end, but not right away. Okay, so we do that in a very gradual and intentional way. And I think about exposures as really allowing us to learn two key pieces of information. Okay, the first learning objective with exposures is the situation might not be as bad as I think. Okay, so in this case, driving might not be as dangerous as I once thought. Okay, the second thing we can learn from exposures is that I can handle my anxiety. I can cope with even a high degree of fear and anxiety. Okay. We have some rules for exposure therapy that I'll talk about in a moment. But before we even start talking about that, before you start any type of exposure therapy, you want to know a couple of things. The first thing you want to know is, what are you most afraid of with driving? Are you afraid of getting into an accident? Are you afraid of driving on the highway or driving on bridges? Are you afraid of losing control of your car? Are you afraid of being stuck in a traffic jam and not being able to get to escape? Are you afraid of having a panic attack while you're driving? Are you afraid of some memories, maybe a traumatic car accident that you've experienced? You're afraid of reliving that or re-experiencing some trauma? Or are you having intrusive thoughts of running somebody over? And we see that very often in the context of obsessive compulsive disorder. All of these questions require slightly different exposures. I don't know what happened here. Okay, yep. So all of those different questions require slightly different exposures. Oh, my slides keep jumping a little bit. Let's see. Okay, sorry about that. So, you want to know what exactly is the core fear that you have. Okay. The second thing that you'll want to know is, what are you doing to avoid feeling anxious while you're driving? Okay. And this one requires a self-assessment. What are the things that I'm doing while I'm driving that take away the anxiety in the moment, but are actually reinforcing the anxiety in the long run? So we listed these already. Driving with a safe person, only driving if you're listening to something, music, radio, podcast, avoiding the highway, only driving on back roads, avoiding congested areas, only driving during certain times of the day or certain weather patterns. We actually have seen folks in our clinic that only drive while they're intoxicated, and I cannot recommend you not doing that enough. Do not drive while intoxicated. Obviously, that brings up the actual danger tremendously, but some folks feel so anxious that they can only drive while feeling a buzz. And so these things actually can increase the actual danger of driving, but they decrease anxiety. So you can see how this can get really tricky. All right. I want to move now to the rules of exposures. And we're going to talk about specific examples of what exposures look like. But to make exposure practice work the best for you, here are the rules that you want to follow every single time. The first rule is that we want exposures to be prolonged. We want them to be at least 40 minutes, ideally. Okay. Some driving is better than zero driving. But to make the most out of exposures, we want you to be driving for 40 minutes continuously. And that is so that you're allowing your body to feel anxious, and you're also allowing enough time for your body to not feel anxious. The thing about fear and anxiety is that it can't last forever. If we stay in a situation long enough without doing our safety behaviors or avoidance or distractions, our anxiety has nowhere to go but down. It will come down eventually. Okay. We also want exposures to be repetitive, doing the exposures over and over and over again. I tell the folks that I work with all the time, it's not enough for us to do an exposure together and then to forget about exposure therapy for the rest of the week and then come back and do another exposure and expect to have your anxiety do anything different. These have to be every single day you're practicing exposures. Okay. While you're doing the exposure, you want to be focusing on how anxious you are. Okay, you want to focus and notice the physical sensations of anxiety Tyler mentioned earlier. My heart's racing. I'm feeling tense. I'm feeling some chest tightness. I'm feeling shaking. We want you to notice those so you can also notice how they change over the course of an exposure session. Okay, oftentimes your heart might be really beating quickly at the beginning of an exposure session, but at the end, you might notice your heart rate's decreased a little bit. A big part of this for exposures is no safety behaviors. So while you're doing exposures, you don't want any distractions. And while we're driving, we don't want any radio, any music, podcast, no playing with the windows, whether you have it up or down. If one of those two things makes you less anxious, we want you to do whatever makes you more anxious. Okay, gum, having a thing of water might be a safety behavior. It's okay to use these at the beginning. But gradually, as you move up the exposure hierarchy, what we want you to do is to take those away so that you can really experience your anxiety. And finally, we want you to be able to practice in a variety of conditions, different weather patterns, different times of day, different cities, different highways. And if you're doing exposures right, it should feel a little worse before it feels better. You should be feeling anxious. Exposures should never be too easy. They should also never be too hard, where you're having like consistent panic attacks while you're doing exposures. We want it to be in the middle ground where it's challenging but not impossible. Okay, I think about that like lifting weights. If you want to build muscle in your bicep, so do some bicep curl, but don't curl a pen. Okay, that's not enough weight. That's too easy. But also don't pick up the 200-pound dumbbell. Your arm's going to fall off. And you can't build muscle if your arm's on the ground. So you need to find that middle ground, something challenging where you can get a good workout and get a good exposure. Your anxiety is up to a challenging level, but it's not impossible. All right. Here's an example of a hierarchy, and I'm going to go through this quickly. So you'll sit down and rate different situations and how much anxiety these different situations bring up for you. So you might rate this on a 0 to 100 scale, 0 being you're not anxious at all, 100 being you're very anxious. You might start out with looking at pictures of cars on a highway, and that might be a 10. You might then look to YouTube videos of highway driving. I can't say enough about YouTube. YouTube has videos of literally every road or highway you can think of. That I Googled or YouTubed Mackinac Bridge driving. There's like 1,000 videos of people just filming themselves driving across the Mackinac Bridge in the winter, at night, when it's raining, when it's windy, when it's a nice sunny day. Watch those. If they bring up anxiety, watch those to get acclimated to what it's like to drive over a bridge. Then you might work your way up to these different situations, and then, actually driving across the Mackinac Bridge might be 100 for you. That might be the top of the hierarchy. Like I said before, we're going to work through these gradually. Okay. So I have some examples of places that you can drive. I want to turn it over to Pat now. I want to make sure we have enough time for Pat to talk about his experiences with exposure therapy before I say anything else about specific examples of exposures that might be helpful for folks in the Southeast Michigan area. So Pat, if you can get your camera on and your mic unmuted, we'd love to hear from you. There you go. There we go.
The video. Yes.
We're good.
Okay.
So yeah, Pat, you can take it away. We can hear and see you.
Okay. Okay. Very good. I wasn't sure. Thank you.
Yep, you're good.
Thanks everyone for joining. I want to say my whole ordeal started December of 2019, and I live in the area of Plymouth. And my family and I went to a concert up at Michigan State. And coming back from there, I was not drinking. We had a nice Christmas concert. Had no idea what was going on once I hit the expressway. Out of the blue, I had super high anxiety. I really didn't know what was happening to me. So, but being the man, don't let the wife drive. I just continued to drive everything. All the lights were highlighted. They were super bright. The reflectors were bright. And I white knuckled it all the way home. It was an intense drive. And that was the beginning of my journey, I would say. And it was quite intense. And that started my whole anxiety and phobia issue that I had never experienced before. I did a lot of driving over the years in my time. I'm 60 years old. So I've got a lot of over the road driving experience, city driving and whatnot. And this was intense. I got myself checked with a hearing specialist thinking it was that. It was not. And that was all in depth. So I reached out to two clinics, one through U of M and another separate one in Ann Arbor. And I was supposed to go to the other clinic, and it was supposed to be a longer wait to go to U of M. But I tell you, I pray, I have faith, and my prayer was answered. And I got a call from U of M, um, the Department of Psychiatry, I guess you would say. And I had a series of questions. Then they called me back and asked me some more, and they said I would fit in the program. So, nonetheless, that started my journey with CBT. And I didn't have the thoughts of being worried about, oh, I might get in a crash on the expressway or someone might hit me or any of that. Mine was just what I felt once I got in the car and the pure nervousness or panic when I would go over a bridge or over an intersection that was over an expressway. And God forbid if I did get on an expressway, it was super hard to handle. So, nonetheless, comes my time for therapy with Dr. Hans. And through our talking, when he starts speaking about retraining the brain, and I thought, okay, everything he was telling me, I believe. And because he was quite informative. And before that, Tyler, I was doing the group CBT as well, so I knew some of this from Tyler. And so I picked up on that and I listened intently. But in my heart, I really, really wanted to get better. I wanted to feel better about myself. I wanted to be able to drive the car without being limited as to where I can go see families, go on vacation, you name it. And so as that began, it was during COVID and whatnot. So Dr. Hans wasn't riding with me, but it was quite unique because we were able to drive, and I had hands free in the car, and he was like my life coach, so to speak. But boy, was I scared out of my wits, and I had my habits where my foot wanted to hit the brake, and you just wanted to find the next exit, and they kept you going, and it was step by step. You have to be willing to not only willing to put in the time, but hopefully, you can afford the gas. That's an understanding. Believe me, what anyone is going through with that, I fully understand. We're all different. We all have a little something different about what we experience. I still have some anxiety, but you learn how to deal with that from day to day. It's not it doesn't become critical. And so as I was going through this, I put in miles and miles and miles and hours and just go out on my own. And it was not just with Dr. Hans. I would just get out there and drive and drive. And I was scared out of my wits, but I was trying to break those little habits I had. And instead of having the white knuckle driving, trying to somewhat relax, it was difficult. It was quite difficult. And as time went on, you don't feel it right away. And that's why going through therapy is so, so important. And you will see the difference. You really will. And going from day one, and when you're nervous like that, you don't remember everything you've been through. But when you go down the road and you accomplish this whole therapy session, for myself, it was like a light bulb went on. I got to a point where all of a sudden it clicked. I wasn't so anxious anymore. And I was able to go out and I found new live freedom. And it was just really amazing. And I still get nervous. I've done my bridges. I've done the Mackinac Bridge in the winter, which I'm sorry, it's beyond 100 if you're going over that in the winter time. The scale of that, maybe a 120. And then what really threw me over the top was a bridge in Savannah, Georgia, which was even higher than the Mackinac Bridge. And my journey, it still goes on a bit. Everything you learn going through the CBT comes in handy because you still get your anxiety, but you always have the tools, so to speak, in your toolbox, and it becomes second nature with you. And I've been through rainstorms, snowstorms, you name it. It seems like every time I drive to Chicago, I'm in some hellacious rainstorm. It's totally bizarre, but that's, God being funny and just, having a little joke on me. So, but it's been terrific. And without this um, therapy and whatnot, I would never be able to do that. And so, just have it in your heart that you really want to do it. Don't ever tell yourself that you cannot do this because you can. Everyone can do this. And like I said, I just hope, for those that don't have the means, hopefully you can find the means, like money wise to get through this, put gas in the car and be able to get out there and drive because it does take the time. And I didn't keep track of how much time I spent or how many miles, but I just drove and I put gas in and I kept doing it over and over. And I'm a great result of what could happen for all this therapy. And, I have Dr. Hans to thank for being that life coach, so to speak. And um, it's been terrific. So I'm sort of at a, end of my thoughts, I guess, right now. Without any other input.
Thank you so much, Pat. And I just want to emphasize how well Pat did over the course. We were just talking before our call. We worked together for 6 months, and I remember how many miles you put in, Pat. You told me it was over 1,000 miles in that 6 months of exposure practice. It's not to say that everyone needs to put 1,000 miles in. They might need more, they might need less, fewer, but it's a testament to how hard you've worked. So it sounds like
Absolutely.
one thing I heard you say is that practice, practice, practice helped.
Yes. No matter how scared you are, when you don't need to put your foot on the brake, don't do it. Get away from those safety habits.
Yeah.
Um, the safety barrels on the side of the road aren't going to jump out and bite you. You have to learn to cope with it. And these doctors are fantastic, and they will get you to where you need to be.
Well, thank you so much, Pat. I really appreciate you being here and sharing your story with us. It's super helpful. And I actually I pulled up a section of highway that Pat told me about that he practiced. I'll get to that in just a minute. I just want to highlight one thing here. If you're out there struggling with getting onto the highway in the first place, Ann Arbor actually has a really nice spot to get practice getting on and immediately getting off the highway. This is off of Washtenaw Avenue down here in the southeastern part of Ann Arbor. There's the 94 and 23 interchange. What you can do is you can get on the highway. You get actually going north. You get over here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Oops. So you get on the highway going north, and then you get off the highway immediately. And then you can loop around so many times in this loop. You can do this like 30 times in an hour. It's a fantastic resource. And I'm happy to guide anybody to some other places that I found helpful for exposures. But you can look for loops like this on Google Maps in an area near you to practice getting on and then getting off the highway. I want to highlight one thing that Pat told me about. It's this stretch of highway. This is on M14, which is a highway right next to Ann Arbor. It goes through Ann Arbor. And this is, Pat said he lives in Plymouth. So it's on the way from Plymouth to Ann Arbor. And this goes from Sheldon to Beck. And when you're researching places to do exposure, go on Google Maps and just do some research to find things like this, exit and entrance ramps on the highway that are in close proximity. So I remember Pat told me this is one of the first stretches of a highway he did. It's a 2-minute drive on the highway, and 2 minutes is a heck of a lot more than 0 minutes on the highway. And I just thought that was a great starting spot. And you can go this way, you can go west, and then you can hop on the highway and go back east and go back west and then go back east. And eventually you'll go up to longer intervals. So you go 5 minutes on the highway and then 10 minutes on the highway, and you gradually build up. And I love highway driving for exposures because you actually keep track. You can measure how many miles, how many minutes you're doing the exposure for. So this is, again, it's all a very gradual approach. You go up longer and longer intervals on the highway. All right, well, I have, looking at the time, we've got about 13 minutes for questions. I know that some questions were sent earlier. Let me see if I can pull those up on my screen. And maybe Pat and Tyler can show their faces again. We can turn your cameras on. We can think about who wants to answer particular questions. So one of the questions was, how important do you find it to avoid engaging in any distractions during exposure therapy for anxiety? Is music okay? And I think this is a great question. And I would say this, we kind of talked about this earlier. Starting out, whatever is getting you driving is going to be helpful. If you need to listen to music to distract for a minute while you're driving, okay. Eventually, for exposure, we want no distractions. We want complete immersion into the anxiety experience where you're not doing any sorts of distractions for that exposure. Is that consistent with what you guys would say, Pat and Tyler?
I would say yes, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I would, if that's what it takes to get you doing exposures, then all right, let's do that. And then just like you said, Hans, with the intention of we're gonna slowly remove that or eventually remove it completely.
Yeah. And again, the reason we do that is so that you can fully feel the anxiety and notice the anxiety and notice how the anxiety changes. Maybe the anxiety stays the same for those 40 minutes of exposure. Maybe it comes up. Eventually, it will likely come down across time. And if you're listening to music, you're not really in touch with the anxiety in the same way. So eventually, we want to remove all sorts of distractions. Let's see. Someone asked if medications can help. And I'll have a caveat here. I'm not a medication prescriber. I'm a psychologist, so is Dr. Grove, who can't comment on specific medications. What I will say is that it depends on what the fear is, what your anxiety is all about. If this is more of an OCD picture, then SSRIs are usually helpful. If this is more of a specific phobia around driving, medications are usually not the first line of treatment. The first line of treatment would be exposure therapy. What I would suggest, regardless of the presenting picture, is to avoid using things like benzodiazepines when you're trying to do exposure therapy. So benzodiazepines are those things like Xanax, Ativan, Klonopin. Those things, I often say, those medications work way too well. And as a psychologist, I can't compete with those medications. Those are working way too effectively. What the problem with those is during an exposure, you're actually not anxious enough for the exposure to do what it needs to do so that your brain can learn. Like Pat said, you're retraining your brain so that you can learn to feel anxious, and then you can learn that the anxiety, you can cope with it, and the bad thing might not happen even if you're really anxious. Okay.
Can I say something?
Please.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I used to get a prescription from my doctor because I had anxiety flying. And after going through all this therapy and everything, I said, you know what, I'm I'm done with it. I'm just going to deal with flying, and I'm much better off. So I don't use it for flying, certainly not for driving. You know, someone once said, only this one time can you use it and not again. So I took it one time. I took it one time before a meeting with Dr. Hans, and I was driving, and he said, okay, Pat, just this one time, and that was it. And then it made sense. We talked about it, and it made total sense because it sort of dulls your, I guess, receptors in a way. And like I said, what I accomplished over that 6-month period was tremendous. And I wish the best for everyone. I hope most, if not everyone, will get the same result I do. You know, if you put in the work and in your heart, you have to believe that what they're telling you is true. And it is true. I mean, I'm a living proof of it. So I'm quite happy with that.
Thank you, Pat. Yeah, again, you really put in the work, and it's paid off. We have a lot of questions here. I wonder what Tyler would say about this one. Where did it go? Oh, how about driving anxiety combined with fear of missing the exit or taking the wrong exit, and hence a strong fear of getting lost? Curious what you would have to say. I've got some thoughts too, but I'm curious, Tyler.
Yeah, I mean, let's lean into that fear. Let's come up with a hierarchy where you're taking on both of those fears. It's a fear of driving and then fear of getting lost. And I guess I would wonder about which one feels scarier. Um, because maybe first we want to actually not go for the scariest thing, but start off with if the fear of getting lost isn't, or maybe that is the scariest thing. So maybe we would first do some of the driving exposures like Hans talked about, and then we'd start having you get lost intentionally, getting off the wrong exit, getting lost on purpose. And I mean, exposure is all about learning that you can manage even the worst thing happening. So I think this was in one of the slides earlier too, of it's not only about understanding we're probably overestimating the probability of a negative outcome. I really lean into the fact that with exposure, you're learning that even when the worst thing does happen, you can manage it. I think in the long run, that's the most helpful thing you can take away from exposure. So sometimes we say we do want the worst thing to happen, or with pretty much everyone I work with, I kind of do want the worst thing to happen. It sounds really bad, but in the long run, it's really helpful because then you're learning, even if the worst thing happens, I can manage it. And ultimately, I think that's what's the most helpful thing for anyone doing exposures.
I completely agree with everything Tyler just said. I think I love that idea of leaning into the fear. This question also brings up a lot of fears of uncertainty, and uncertainty cuts across every anxiety problem, and uncertainty and anxiety are BFFs. And so you can imagine getting lost. I don't know where I am. I don't know how to get back. A lot of anxiety comes up, and leaning into that and getting lost on purpose, maybe this person can turn off their ways and see what happens. See what happens if you take the wrong exit on purpose. Can you turn yourself around, and see how that anxiety responds? I like this question too. Do you have any special recommendations for the short-lived but intense anxiety associated with urgent situations like having to change a lane, merge with traffic, etc.? My initial thought to this, and I'd be curious what Tyler would have to say, or Pat, is practice. This comes down to practice doing these things. Tyler said it beautifully earlier. When we avoid doing certain behaviors or activities for years, our anxiety goes way up and we're out of practice. I actually so I started in the clinic in August 2020, and I saw so many people with driving anxiety. And I think a lot of that came from people stopped driving. during the pandemic, during lockdown. We got out of practice. And so when you get practicing again, maybe start driving in neighborhoods. Maybe you drive on, Highway 12 in this area I think the speed limit's like 55. There's lots of turnoffs. That's a great place to start practicing merging lanes. Then you might work your way up to US 23. Then you might work your way up to 96, then 75, 94. There's different highways, and you got to do your research, but different highways have different traffic volume, different speeds. And so just practicing in those situations. And it's interesting, the writer says urgent situations. Anxiety tells us that there's always a sense of urgency. And when you get enough practice, you train your brain to say, oh, this is just a thing that I do. It's just it's a natural thing, a natural part of driving. This doesn't require a lot of urgency or attention. I don't know if you have other thoughts about that, Tyler or Pat.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Pat, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the sudden lane change thing, that's definitely more practice than anything else, because it's just sort of like preparing, because some people aren't paying attention, some people are following too close. It's learning, some of it is learning how to read traffic itself. Like, oh, there's 5 cars ahead of me. They're all super close to each other. And then all of a sudden it's, oh, I'm following too close. I got to make an urgent change. Or I might miss my exit, that kind of thing. So, I myself have tried to create like less distraction in the car. Sometimes I'll turn down the music, or I won't be on the phone with anyone, hands free, of course. I never go without being hands free. Have to be hands free or it's no phone call. But that cuts down on my distraction. And I try to read the traffic, so that helps. And now that, I have a son that's going to be starting driving, and, I'm trying to teach him a little bit, not that I'm always Mr. Happy, but, that's life in the big city, as they say. But yeah, it's a lot of it is learning to try to read the traffic, not following too close, and just, if you can help, knowing where you're going and, where you have to go. That's my input.
Yeah, I would I agree with all of that, and I'd be curious too. What Hans was saying is, I think if you are doing exposures, and again, we don't throw people into the deep end of the pool. We have them test the waters and eventually work their way out to deeper and deeper waters, building their confidence. But I'd be curious, that idea of urgency itself, you may start to challenge that just through your exposure work over time. So just like Hans was saying, is that I wouldn't be surprised if you're really leaning into the fear, doing the exposure work, that the idea of urgency itself kind of changes, and then it may not feel as urgent, because you've got all of this experience and confidence that, all right, if it doesn't go the way that I'd like it to, or it does go to that worst case scenario, I can manage it.
Yeah, exactly. Someone asked, how do you keep yourself calm when driving in conditions that you've had bad driving experiences in before? I think this is a great question. And Tyler and I were just talking about this prior to the call, or to the webinar. We're in Michigan, right? We're going to have whiteouts. We're going to have really blizzardy conditions. Somebody mentioned that we have a flash flood warning due to weather coming up here. Again, to kind of come back to what I said earlier, we're encouraging safe driving with exposures, right? If there are things that you do to make yourself safe in actually dangerous conditions, I'm all for it. When I'm in the middle of a blizzard and driving 5 miles an hour on the highway and people are whipping by me at 30 miles an hour, I have the music off. I am I've got my death grip on the steering wheel here. I'm leaning forward and I'm completely focused. In my mind, that is safe driving. Would I encourage that same driving in the middle of the summer on a sunny day in the highway with no terrible weather conditions? No. That's anxious driving. That's sending the signal to your brain that something terrible is going to happen any second. But when it's actually a dangerous driving situation, we want you to engage in things that make you feel like you can drive safely. With bad driving experiences before, with conditions, I would say use the hierarchy to try to simulate. Think about exposures as simulations. You want to simulate whatever you're most afraid of in safe conditions. So if your bad experience happened at night, as you're getting back to driving, start driving later and later in the evening and seeing what that's like, and working your way up to driving at like 2 in the morning, which also might be useful to simulate winter driving because it gets darker earlier in the day. So if you can drive at night now, you know what it's like to drive in limited visibility conditions. So there's always ways that we can try to replicate what you're most afraid of with exposures. We just have to, like Tyler said, go after the fear, follow it, lean into it. I don't know if anybody else has other thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I would say that's pretty much right on, because I forgot about the nighttime part. That was tough for me for a while. And but the more, and I think it was after my therapy, I just kept driving at night, and I kept going and going, and it dissipated. That part went away. During my therapy, I decide to drive. It's raining out. I do what I think is safe practice anyhow, even before all this took place, which was, if I'm going to drive the speed limit but at a lower speed, I tend to stay in the right lane where slower traffic should be. So that's a good idea in itself. And then if you need to be a little more cautious, like everyone else, and slow down a tad bit, then you can do it. And you're not worried about anyone else behind you. Because as I was going through my therapy, I was always worried about the person behind me. I'm slowing them up. I'm worried about that. But as you stay over to the right and you gain your confidence, even in inclement weather, in due time, your confidence will build over time. And once you get past your all your time with your doctor and you're set free and ready to go, like I said, countless times in inclement weather, it's like, it's not always pleasant, but it's not horrifying either. It's like, some of it was actually pretty cool. It was sort of like an adventure. It was like, this is pretty neat. I wonder how many people out there are scared beyond belief, and I know I can handle this. And I did.
Oh, I think that's such a great point to end on, Pat, that after you do successful exposure therapy, not only are you conquering your fears, but you're better able to handle uncertainty and fear than probably 99% of the population. Most people are afraid of the Mackinac Bridge, but if you do enough exposures, then you got this, and it's exciting, and it's an adventure. I am looking at the time. I'm seeing that we're over after 6, so I want to wrap things up quickly. I do have, somebody had questions about heights, fear of driving in heights. Michigan, we're limited, right? It's a pretty flat state, but I will point to a couple things that I like that I've used with exposures before. First of all, there's an interchange at the Southfield Freeway and I-96. It's a beautiful interchange. There's 3 levels here, and it's great for exposures because you can start we can start down here on 96. You can go up here on Southfield. You can go up here on, take this exit to get on the 2nd level, and then you can get up here. And actually, I've driven on this several times. Looking over, it's kind of gnarly because you can see all the cars weaving in and out, and it's pretty anxiety provoking. But that's a great place. We also have there's a Skyway Bridge in Toledo. It's about an hour south of Ann Arbor. It's not super high, but it has this really imposing bridge look. And I think Pat did a couple passes on this one. I think if I remember right, we did 12 passes in an hour, which was pretty good.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did.
And then Zilwaukee Bridge is a big one. This comes up all the time when I work with folks that are afraid of bridges. This is near Saginaw. It's about an hour and a half north from Ann Arbor. This is a great bridge because there's exit points on either side of the bridge. And you can, once you go over the bridge, you can zip back up and go back. And then, of course, the mighty Mac is probably the top of most people's hierarchy if you're concerned about getting into accidents and anxiety around driving. Eventually, I'd like to publish a manual that's freely available on the Department of Psychiatry's website detailing all of these things. But if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to talk about driving anxiety all day, and I'm glad that we had an hour to talk about this. Last thing, we have some resources here. I think Stephanie and Kat have put these in the chat already, but there is a website called michiganhighways.org. It's compiled by this guy who's really into highways and bridges, and he's detailed everything you would want to know about every highway in Michigan. It's a useful resource to know more about what's available in Michigan. And this QR code is for the CBT Basic Manual for Anxiety that clinicians here in our anxiety clinic have developed. It's a free resource. It's 120 pages. It covers everything that you'd ever want to know about exposure therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, every anxiety disorder. It's a great resource to get you started on the process. And I put over here, YouTube and Google Maps are really helpful resources to start the exposure process and do some research for where you want to start with this journey. All right, with that, I think we should probably wrap up. I want to thank everyone who came today to talk through driving anxiety, to learn more about this. I know it's really difficult. It likely feels really scary to get going on this. But like Pat said, you just have to start and you have to believe in it and keep driving. I think that's my last slide here. Just keep driving. If I can pull up Dora, there she is. Just keep driving, just keep driving. I want to thank Dr. Grove and Pat for participating in our webinar today. I thought it was a really great addition. All right, so we'll end here. Thank you, everyone. Hope everyone has a nice night.